In Vlog 5, we're going to be covering a very important distinction that has structured the history of philosophy, the distinction between idealism and materialism. We can think of idealism and materialism as a fundamental division internal to our knowing practices. Idealists tend to view things from the perspective of the idea, and materialists tend to view things from the perspective of matter. Logically, then, the division between idealism and materialism is a division about ontological primacy. This means, what do we give a higher level of primary being? Are ideas more fundamental than matter, or is matter more fundamental than ideas? And how do these two forms of being relate to one another? Throughout the history of philosophy, we can pinpoint two figures that in some sense stand as figures that structure this division internal to our knowledge. The most famous of these two are Plato and Democritus. Plato is famous for positing that the highest level of reality is structured by ideal forms. For Plato, everything in our material reality is an imperfect version of a perfect ideal form. Alternatively, Democritus is famous for positing the idea of atoms. For Democritus, fundamental reality is structured by little subcomponents of physical matter, which he called atoms. Of course, in the scientific materialist worldview, we tend to view things from Democritus's perspective, and have even validated the basic hypothesis that Democritus forwarded. On the other hand, religious people and spiritual people tend to see things from the point of view of Plato. Consequently, this division, which we can say is a division between Plato and Democritus, is a fundamentally important division in historical knowledge. When we view idealists and materialists as types of historical creatures, we might say that idealists reflect or mediate ideal or the highest form. What this means is that what's important for idealists is not necessarily the external world, but making sure that one is constantly living in relationship to the highest good, the highest truth, and the highest beauty that one can conceive in ideation. Alternatively, materialists as historical creatures tend to focus their attention on understanding the natural world, how it works, how we can know what's true about the natural world, and how we can know our place in the natural world. Both have extreme utility, and both have led to extremely positive historical movements. However, both are also fundamentally problematic. On the one hand, idealists could get leveled for a type of delusion. In other words, idealists, from the materialist perspective, are lost in ideals which have no correlation or have no truth value in relation to the world. On the other hand, materialists could be criticized for basically forgetting about the nature of subjectivity and forgetting about the nature of our own consciousness. This leads to a type of nihilism. If one is living in a purely material universe with no higher ideals of being, it's easy to become not delusional, but disillusioned. Is there a higher synthesis between idealism and materialism? Of course, many thinkers have tried to think about how this division of knowledge could be reconciled. One way of thinking about a reconciliation is to focus on interaction. Instead of focusing about ideas and material as either separate things or as one having more primacy over the other, we can think about the way they interact. We can think about the way in which matter is being mediated by ideas, and we can think about the way in which ideas emerge in relationship to material conditions. This perspective places a lot more emphasis not on the substance of idea or the substance of matter, but rather on processes and relations between the two, or processes and relations internal to the two. So instead of thinking about whether or not a process is material or ideal, we can just think about them as general processes and relations which are part of one continuous being. This may be an interesting way to think. The problem for this view is that it doesn't yet help us to approach problems of observation in other words, problems for our consciousness, what is it? And also the problems of time and history. Throughout the history of idealism and materialism, knowledge tends to presuppose a type of atemporal or ahistorical notional mediation. Going back to Plato, the ideal forms are eternal. Or going back to Democritus, the atoms are eternal. In the physical, scientific, materialist worldview, we might even say that space-time functions on an absolute background. In this way, we haven't yet made sense of the function of time and the function of history in the interaction between the ideal and the material. This naturally lends itself to a potentially interesting philosophical hypothesis, the idea of evolution. The idea of evolution is, of course, a scientific idea which is grounded with Charles Darwin's work, but evolution can also be framed as a philosophical notion. Evolution as a philosophical notion may be an interesting way to think about the foundation between ideas and matter. Instead of thinking about eternal, observerless matter or ideal forms, we may think about observer-dependent material and ideal evolution. In this way of thinking, what we're asked to confront as a fundamental philosophical problem is the way in which ideas and matter interrelate and the nature of causation. We haven't yet solved the issue of cause and the issue of the basic understanding of causation, even though it fundamentally structures our knowledge of reality. Cause and effect is primary in the way in which we connect knowledge of reality, but we still don't yet understand fundamentally what causation is. Another very important philosophical dimension to consider is the immanence of ideal materiality. When we think about science and scientific processes which are not just reflecting nature, like solar systems and trying to understand the evolution of life, but rather changing nature, whether that's through genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, or robotics, we may be asked to think about the way in which our ideals are mediating ideal materiality. This is, of course, a hugely critical, but also hugely controversial question, but a very important one for 21st century philosophy. I hope this overview of the relationship between idealism and materialism gives you a little perspective on the difference between the two ways of thinking and how they could potentially be mediated in the future. Thanks for listening, and thanks for watching.